Hi there, and welcome to this 20 minutes tutorial about creating a fair and pine forest in Blender. So this tutorial has 5 parts, and each part shows roughly how to handle something and creating this fair and pine forest. And if you're interested in more, I created a full Blender course that is available on the Blender market. So this is part 1, and here we go. So we start with a plane and we double the size so we have a slightly bigger surface. And the next thing we do is adding a terrain texture with a diffuse, roughness and normal map. To add some displacement, we built a node tree in geometry nodes to have full control on the level of displacement. As soon as we're ready with the displacement, we start adding some ground cover, making some simple planes and adding these on the terrain with the geometry nodes. We're trying to rotate them, matching them on the terrain, and as soon as we're ready, we're making a render to take a look how that looks. Then we continue with adding some rocks and also some branches to add some variation on the plane. And if you think these are looking good, you can go for a new render. And look at that, that looks pretty nice. All right, we continue with working on Mars, creating some planes, adding a texture. We're making some patches to add these later on the terrain. Same way as adding the rocks and the branches, we're using the geometry nodes to spread these all on the terrain. And by optimizing the scene, we're using proxy models to have a faster viewport. And you can also pick a color for your proxy. So these proxies are easy to recognize, so you don't have to look which proxy is for what model. So as soon as you render, these proxies will be replaced with the original model. We import some fair trees so we can blend them with the terrain. The fair trees will be replaced later with the original trees. But for this scene, we just want to see how it looks and how they blend. And to continue, we also add some more nature props, in this case some fern, and we also need a proxy model for that. And then we can make a render and looks how this all blends together. The fair trees with the cover and the fern and some rocks in the foreground. This is already a good looking scene. So that brings us to part number 2, and that is creating a large forest floor. So the first thing we do in this part is sizing the terrain to 200 meters. And as soon as we are lowering the props and we do the rotation and scaling, we have very tiny props all over the terrain. And we need a low amount because if we use the original value, the viewport will slow down. And before working on the optimization, we make a render to take a look if everything still looks fine. Then we jump back to geometry nodes and building a new node tree to work on scene culling. And scene culling optimizes your scene so you have quite a lot of objects close to the camera, and as soon as you go away from the camera, it fades away. And this boosts your performance a lot, also with rendering. And the great thing about this culling workflow is that we now have a slider to define where we want to have the density of the objects. All right, let's jump to the next part, and that is some LOD workflow, level of detail. So we have high resolution models and lower resolution. So we start with the rocks, we're adding a new collection and adding a decimate modifier to add a lower resolution model for the rocks. So then we add some more nodes so we can add these low poly models on our plane, and we're adding a red proxy so you can see the transition between the high resolution, the gray ones, and the lower resolutions, the red ones. And of course you have a slider on this point as well to define where the overlap needs to be. So we want to have like a lot of gray ones in the foreground, and in the background it starts to fade away. So we can do that with all kind of models, also with the trees, and these trees are still stand-in, so we do not have the full trees yet, but it helps to get a sort of idea how the scene looks like. And at this point, we can still add new props. The only thing you need to do is appending your model, but you have to create a lower resolution from it for the LOD, including a proxy model for a fast viewport. Then you're adding this in your geometry nodes. choosing a different seat to see if everything still works, finding a nice position for your camera so we can render the scene after all the hard work. And look at that, that's a shiny scene. And even with animation, it looks even better. So that brings us to part number 3, and that is creating a path and a river on the terrain. And the way I like to do that is by drawing lines so we can define where we want to have a path and where we want to have a river to flow. But before we jump to the creation of paths and river, I like to gain some inspiration by using an AI image generator and looking how paths look like, rivers, trees, how they flow, how they look, how the real world looks like by going to a location and just observing it and looking at it. And also me for a path demonstrating how it all looks. So from this point, we can start working on this workflow. So we're drawing a line on the terrain and we start adding nodes to add some depth on it so we can define how wide it will be and the depth for the path. And the great thing of doing this all with geometry nodes is that we can exclude where we want to have the props to be visible on the terrain. So we don't want to have the nature props on the path, but we want to define how wide it will be. And this is all possible with geometry nodes and this setup. Alright, so I'm adding some scattering so we have a more rough look for the terrain and for the path. Otherwise it looks too straight and that's not what we want. So now we can make a render and taking a look how everything blends together. All right, now it's time for the river. We're drawing a new line by duplicating the path system and renaming it to the river. The only thing we need to do for this river is changing some values to add more depth and making it wider so it looks like a river. And the same thing as we did for the path, we need to exclude where we want to have the props to be visible on the terrain. So we tweak the depth and we change the material color and now we have a river bed. The only thing that's missing is the river, so we need to work on that. So we're building a new geometry node setup for the river, so it's extruding. We also need to extract the X and Y values so we can animate and add a texture later on. And there you can see the vertex colors. So now we're building a displacement map. Of course, we need to do this the right way. And if you do this the right way, it will flow according to these X and Y coordinates. Great, isn't it? All right, let's speed up and taking a look at some reference images because we want to know how real rivers looks like. So we can see the foam going all the way and from the top it looks even better. So we need to observe this, taking a good look so we can recreate it in geometry nodes. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to duplicate some river nodes so we can have less waves on the left and right. And at the same time, we can work on the materials shader, so adding some river reflections. Now we go back to the reference, taking a look at the foam because foam is important on rivers. So we need to work on that as well. We're adding some foam shading on the terrain and we need to blend this with the original shader, excluding the left and right. So if you combine these two, you have some nice looking foam in the middle. Looks perfect. So at this point, you can append your river to the main scene. You're linking this to your river path and then you're aligning this with the terrain. And now it's flowing. That looks great. One thing you can do is adding some river rocks so the river blends better with the terrain. And of course, don't forget to create a quick animation. So after all the hard work, you're creating a new render and you have your path and your river. That's great, but it all looks better in a nice looking animation. And at this point, we arrive at part number 4, creating the fir and pine trees. So before making these actually trees, we start looking at some reference, how they look in the real world, taking a look at some sapling and medium trees, and also some twigs from the fir trees. And then when you have like all these references, you can start working on the twig. Starting with the branch, we're just making a very simple model, aligning this so it matches the reference. And then we can start working on the needles. Be aware making a very low poly needle model, because if you add too many vertices, it's getting too complex. So when you're finished with one of these models, you can make duplications and adding some rotations so they're not looking the same, and also applying a texture. The next step is working with geometry nodes. So we're making a new node tree and we separate all these needles on the twig. That can be a little bit complicated, so we're taking the time, just starting to add them in the middle and later on also on the left and right, so they're aligned with the right rotation value, so it looks like realistic. We're making some variation for the twig, so you do not have one static twig. That adds some realism on the fir tree when adding all these twigs on it. And the next part is finally start working on these trees. And we do that with the sapling add-on. That's an inbuilt Blender plugin. You just need to activate it and you start adding the right values to get a decent result. You get a lot of freedom to get all of this. So for this project, we're using the sapling add-on just for the branch generation, and we use geometry nodes to apply the twigs on the right position. One thing I really like about the sapling add-on is that you can animate your tree fast and slow, just what kind of settings you use. So that's a great thing. So in geometry nodes, we can apply our twigs on the branches and we have full control, so we can put these on the tips with the right rotation value. And when you animate a tree, it all looks very realistic. So that's a great thing. Next up is adding the photo scanned fir root. We're aligning this with the branches, with the root from the branches, and then we merging this together so we get one piece. So we need to align this a little bit more, then adding a vertex color. So it's very key that you also blend the texture, so you have a good overlap, so you won't see a sort of a stitch. Then we make a render and take a look at our nice looking tree. So when working on all these trees, I like to create a plane where I start adding these. We now just have one tree, but later we have more. So we start adding to make some variations, some with more or with less twigs, just to have the variation in the scene. Next up is adding some small broken branches on the root, and that adds some nice realistic touch for these firs, because firs have these small branches on the root. So when we're finished with the large trees, we arrive at the medium trees. They are slightly different, smaller, but also the branches start at the bottom. And we have to change the way the twigs are distributed. Next part is the small sapling trees. These are very tiny and covered on the forest floor. Without these sapling trees, your terrain looks a little bit empty. So we also make tree variations for the medium and sapling. And when you completed the medium and the sapling trees, don't forget to make an animation to take a look if everything animates well. Then we jump to the pine twig, and that one is different than the fir because these needles are sort of blended with each other, and these are taller. So that's a huge difference if you compare them with fir twigs. Also, the way the needles are distributed on the twig is different, so we have to change the values from the geometry nodes to create a good looking pine twig. So the next step is taking a look at some references from pine trees before we start working on the sapling add-on to regenerate these pine trees. So we use different values to match the look. The way the branches are distributed is different than the fir trees, so we need different settings to get this all right. So now we're going to add the pine twigs, and we're adding the pine root and merging this with the branches. We're doing some vertex color to match the textures because the root has a different texture than the branches. We're doing some color matching, and then we move to the next part, and that is also adding some dead branches on the sides of the root. These are a little bit more thick and that fits this pine tree. Then we move on to the medium tree, same story as the fir tree, just a little different approach how this pine tree is built up. But yeah, it's small and it's more dense. We're making a render and look at these pines looking wonderful. All right, Same for the medium tree, we also need a small pine sapling, and when we make a render, this all looks very shiny. So that's pretty much it for the trees. What's left is adding all of these models on the plane, and we're making a render to see all the hard work in reality. And that looks great, but better when it's all animated with some nice sunlight. That looks really juicy. All right, let's jump to part number 5. And this is the scene creation. So we open the main terrain and creating a new scene layer. And this is important because we can import the high resolution trees in this separated scene and it won't interfere with the speed of the viewport. So that's very important. We're generating some proxy tree models. That's important when we're going to replace the trees. You don't want to have these high resolution trees to be displayed. So when you replace them, you can define how many you want and the size. And you're going to combine these with the medium trees and the sapling trees. And you can find out how many you want in the scene so it looks good to you. So at this point, it's very important that all the assets are in balance with the surrounding. So when making renders, it's not important that you get a pretty looking image, but the props should display it well. And it takes some time to get this all right, looking at the depth of the path or the river. Something important is how many river rocks you want to have or how big these are. It takes time to get this all right. But as soon you're happy with the main looks in your scene and you think everything is in balance, we can jump to the next part, and that is working on the main scene. And for this, I'm using the Midjourney AI image generator to fill in a simple prompt of what I like to see, and it outputs images that I can pick and regenerate. And this is one of the first times I'm using this generator. And it helps me to find something specific. What is quite hard when I do a location visit, for example, if I want to see a rocky path with surrounded by fair trees, it really helps me to get a sort of look that I'm looking for. I don't want to copy the looks, but it inspires me to aim for that specific look, what I find in the AI image generator. So I will pick 3 types of images, one with a path, one with a river, so you can play around with the river rocks and the dead trees hanging on the river. So we also want to work on a scene that shows a full strength with a castle ruin in the middle, the river and all the pine trees surrounding it. All right, we're opening the main scene and we're going to fine tune it. The first thing is playing around with the light source. So we're trying to get some air in the scene so it's not too dark, and we're adding some more vegetation around the path so it adds some more realism. These are all sort of simple steps to start with. Another thing is adding path roots. Because when I looked at the reference, I could see all these roots on the pad, and I thought it was like a nice idea. So I scanned these roots and I can implement these in the scene. And that looks great. So looking at the result, we now have roots, nice way of how the scene is lighted. All right, so when we finished, we jump to the next part of the scene, and that is the river scene. And therefore, we're going to shape the terrain to something we like. So we can draw a line for where the river will be. The river will spawn, and we're adding the river. We're also adding a path on the right side, but we also can add a path on the other side. And we can find out if we find a nice looking spot to render this out. So we're positioning the camera and we're changing the rocks. I mean, this is all really simple to apply. And as soon as you think you're ready, you can go for a new render. So we're now jumping to the final scene, and that is the large scene with the castle ruin in the middle, with the river and the pine trees around us. It's quite heavy, but it's worth working on it. So we're using the same template as for the river. We're going to make some adjustments, removing the path. also removing the river, but what we will keep is the shape of the terrain. We're just going to slightly change that so we can go all around of this terrain. We're also making some hills in the background and in the middle. And if you're doing this the right way, you are able to just enable your trees again. And it's important to use the culling to have trees in the distance. So for the fir and pine trees, it's very important. So at this point, we can draw the river path all around on the terrain. So when we positionize the camera, we can see it in total. So when this is ready, we append the river and we align this with the terrain. And sometimes it can happen that we have to make some hand adjustments to align this a bit better. So it works. All right, that's great. So we turn back the trees, and because we have like a small pad on the top, the trees are removed. And you can do that by increasing the white value. So I'm importing some of my rune structures from my main course, Creating 3D Environments. And you can just simply grab one of these runes and putting them on top. But whatever model you can use, if you have a sort of a modern structure, you can also blend this with the terrain. I'm using these rune structures because they simply look nice. So for this scene, I like to adjust the mist. Normally we use just a sort of a fog box, but this type is different because I want to have low hanging clouds in the scene. So I'm using a noise texture and I'm mixing this so we get a specific look. I'm using an emission to have a fast output, but as soon I've got something that I like, I replace this with a volume scatter and putting this over my main terrain so we can render this and taking a look how it looks. It can take some time before you're getting it right, but when you are happy, you're adding this in your scene and you can just adjust the position so you have the look you prefer. Then it's just time for rendering it and see what happens in your scene.